Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast plug-in to fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists and innovators that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
We're in a world of constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change. This is just, and if we look over the last 25 years, and at some point, after kind of 7, 8 major kind of fundamental things in 20 some odd years, this is the new normal. And the challenge that leaders face is they kind of don't know what to do with all of this constant disruption. And it feels like no matter what they do, they're going to get it wrong. And I argue that the reason that it's hard for them is they haven't been trained in systems thinking. And the idea behind systems leadership is the ability to fundamentally master certain dualities and bring it inside of ourselves. And then also to see systems and understand action and reaction of functions inside of a company and its ecosystem, etc. The ability to live in the duality, the ability to manage context. And then how do they navigate through what I call cross pressures? These cross pressures that people are struggling with. And that's the point of the book.
That was Robert E. Siegel, lecturer in management at Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he has taught various courses ranging from systems leadership to financial management for entrepreneurs to the Industrialist's dilemma to corporations. He is also a venture partner at Piva Capital and a general partner at XSeed Capital and sits on multiple boards of directors and has led investments in Zooz, Cirrosecure, and Lex Machina, among others. His multi-lens background and approach have afforded Robert a deep, intricate understanding into leadership in our constantly in flux world today and how it requires an ever more nuanced approach. In this discussion, we dive into key insights from his most recent 2025 book, The Systems Leader: Mastering the Cross Pressures That Make or Break Today's Companies, a perfect complement to his first book, The Brains and Brawn Company. We discuss the constant web of dualities that the modern systems leader confronts on an ongoing basis, as well as how, while our business frameworks have long been trending toward change-driven frameworks with terms like ambidextrous organization and exploitation versus exploration, world parameters have grown increasingly complex and interdependent, requiring a different set of leadership skills. The key characteristics of a systems leader, including 5 cross pressures that these leaders must learn to balance to be effective. The 4 abilities that leaders must develop, including developing a product manager mindset, the ability to live at the intersection of customer needs, market demands, and the inner workings of your company. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Siegel. Rob, it is great to be here with you. I have been really enjoyed preparing for this, going from your experience as an operator, as an entrepreneur, as a VC, looking at this merging of digital and physical, and now landing on what I think so few people talk about is the leadership implications of that. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kyan. It's great to be here.
Where are you joining us from?
I am actually in my office at Stanford University, and I am about to go teach a class on systems leadership right when you and I finish with my co-teacher and friend and mentor, Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of GE.
Of course. Is he in every class, or is this a special class?
In this course, we've done it together for the last 8 years. And we do it tag team. So there's a process. We get a guest to come in. Jeff and he'll lead off with a lecture based upon a framework that we're introducing in that session. We do a case on the guest, and then the guest kind of interacts with the students at the end of the class. Great. Who's your guest today? Are you allowed to? I'm a Cyril Choksi, who's the CEO of Vantage Data Centers. So we've done a lot of stuff on data centers and power and energy. This year, we've been lucky enough to have people like Roger Goodell from the NFL. On Thursday, we have the president of Dartmouth. Next week, we'll have the president of BYD Auto. So there's a lot of, we've had to, it's really neat. And we get entrepreneurs who've come in. We had the founding managing partners of Blockchain Capital earlier in this quarter. So it's been a great class to teach.
Amazing. Maybe we'll get to this later, but just quickly, do you think we'll ever get to buy a BYD here?
Oh, that's complex. I don't see it happening anytime in the near term. I think as long as there's geopolitical conflict between the US and China, I can't see it happening. By the way, they build great cars. You see them in Europe, but I think issues around competition, data protection, lack of trust between the governments, I think it's going to be very difficult.
Yep. Yeah, I've got to spend a little time in China this last year and did see a manufacturing plant, not for BYD, but for Chery. Yep. So impressive. So impressive. Okay.
Absolutely.
I want to start with the same two questions that I ask all of our guests. The first one, it could have nothing to do with your work at all, just to get us to know you a little bit more personally. Please complete the sentence for me. If you know me, you know that.
If you know me, you know that I'm a big Liverpool football fan.
Really? Where did that come from? How long have you been a football fan and when Liverpool became yours?
So I was part of the first generation that ever played soccer, football in this country. So I started when I was 5 and played through university. Wasn't very good, but loved the game. And I never had a team because, soccer in the US never really took off at the professional level. And there was a show on television on the old Fox Soccer channel called Being Liverpool. Brendan Rodgers was the manager, and it was kind of one of these behind the scenes shows. This was in about 2012. And I started watching the show, and it was so well done. And I said, yeah, Liverpool, they could be my team. The Beatles are from Liverpool. But perhaps most importantly, the song that's the anthem of the team is You'll Never Walk Alone. And I just love that sentiment. And one of my bucket list items was to go sing You'll Never Walk Alone with 45,000 of my best friends, which I did in October of 2023. And I got to tell you, it was better than the day our children were born, which makes me a horrible person. but it was amazing.
We'll filter out the advertisement to your kids on this podcast.
They've heard me say it before. They know I love them, but they...
Yeah, gotcha. That is awesome. But I do think that U.S. football is coming up. I mean, U.S. soccer football is coming up, and I'm a diehard Philadelphia Union fan. I watch every game. So, and we did have one of the owners of Philadelphia Union on the podcast as well. So, patience. We're going to get there.
With 330 million people, and it seems like every child in this country plays, we should be better than we are, and hopefully we'll eventually figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I think I think our bench is so deep. I mean, we started 2 decades ago, and I know that I'm traveling all over the country with my daughter and sitting there watching her and her girls play. So, okay, let's talk about strategy. This is a podcast on strategy. I ask this question for everyone. I always get a different answer. What is your definition of strategy?
For me, strategy is the ability to see key trends and vectors before others and to come up with a set of actions based upon a thorough understanding of both internal and external forces of a company. And so you got to be able to get to 90,000 feet and kind of see the wins before everybody else, but then be able to come up with a plan of attack for your company. It can't be too theoretical. It's got to be applied. Great strategists understand both strategy and execution.
Yes. And the linkage between there and many of the points that you make in Systems Leader, I think, are related to that translation so that it activates people and understanding and knowledge. Excellent. Thank you. So I am excited to dive into the Systems Leader, but I think a good setup for this for those few people who haven't read Brains and Brawn. I love the framework. Would you mind just laying out, first of all, what did that book come out of? And then if we can go into the framework.
Absolutely. So I used to teach a course here at Stanford called the Industrialist Dilemma. And it was started first with me and Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box. And then we were joined by Max Wessel, who at the time was the Chief Innovation Officer at SAP. And the thesis of the book was that we are in a world where every product and service has a digital and connected component. So that even if you make a physical thing, be it a car or a piece of, camera equipment or whatever it is, it's going to have a digital component. And when every product and service is connected, you have to design products differently and you have to organize your company differently. And so we looked at a whole bunch of attributes as to how these things shape the way companies are making and selling things. And Our thesis was that incumbents are not doomed and disruptors are not ordained, that we could learn the best practices from companies, and be they incumbents or be they disruptors, on how to do digital and physical well. And that led to the book, The Brains and Brawn Company, which was a way of kind of capturing how we saw and learned from leaders from all over the world over the 8 years that we taught that course. And so the framework was, we came up with 5 digital attributes. That's the brain side. And the first was like the left hemisphere, the ability to use analytics in product design. There was the right hemisphere of our brain, which is creativity. There's the amygdala, using empathy. There's the prefrontal cortex, how we think about risk. And then finally, the inner ear, which was balancing ownership and partnership. And we really thought about those as digital or softer attributes. But the physical side, the brawn side, we talked about the spine, logistics. We looked at hands, the craft of manufacturing and making things, muscles operating at scale on a global basis, hand-eye coordination, how you shape and guide your ecosystem, and finally, stamina, how you survive for an extended period of time. And we studied companies that were disruptors here from Silicon Valley or from other parts of the world, as well as global incumbents that maybe were 100 or 200 years old, and tried to learn best practices from each, with the thesis and belief that if companies could learn both the brains and the brawn framework, they could figure out where are they good and how to stay good, and also where are they lacking some of the things that they needed and how could they improve upon them.
Well, just to help us visualize that, what was an example of a company that exemplifies the right combination or the ability across both of brains and brawn?
It's funny. We looked at companies that did really well in maybe one thing particularly well, because no company was good at all 10. And that was actually the point of the framework, was just to say, if you had 10 of these attributes and 10 of them on a 1 to 10 scale, you could score yourself, a perfect score would be 100. No company was going to score 100. So for example, when we looked at analytics, strangely enough, we started with Schwab, the large financial services company. And you might sit back and say, how do you think about Schwab as an analytics company? They're a financial services company, but they have a ton of data on their customers. And so what we found in studying Schwab as a prototype and an archetype was that they had data scientists and they had data engineers. That was just kind of, if you will, what got you into the game. But how they thought about using the data and when to use the data and when not to use the data. How do you build trust with your customer base about making people feel confident that you're going to use their data in the right way? That's where Schwab really shined. We looked at things like empathy with the amygdala. We studied Kaiser Permanente, the large healthcare service provider, and Bernard Tyson, who has since passed away, talked a lot about how he used empathy in dealing with doctors and nurses and patients and members, as well as the government, which they had to interact with. On logistics, with spine, we looked at 3 retail companies. We looked at Home Depot, we looked at Target, and we looked at Best Buy, and how they really blended digital and physical on logistics. And on organizing ecosystems, we looked at Google and what they do with Android. And so in each of these areas, we tried to look at companies and say they excelled in this particularly one attribute better than others. But no company was perfect. And the whole point of Brains and Brawn was to allow companies to be able to think about, okay, where am I doing well and how do I hold on to my competency there? And where do I need to improve and invest?
Got it. Let me ask you I can think of 3 reasons why you would find that no company does them all well. One is that it's just a lot of work to be good at 10 things. Another is there hasn't been the list of the 10 things, so I've only been focusing on a few of them. Another is that being good at one necessarily makes it difficult to be good at another. Do you think it's any of those or something different?
I think it's some combination of all of them. I think that a lot of times, like, you look at the DNA of an organization, and that's what we saw. Like, the DNA would shape why a company was good at one versus the other. So let's compare Airbus and Uber. Airbus is really good at manufacturing. They're really, really good at systems engineering. They struggle in getting data off the asset. They struggle in hiring digital talent. Uber, great at user experience, great at logistics, terrible at driver relations, terrible at government relations. So a lot of times the DNA of the organization would shape where their strengths were. I think the thing that kind of led us into the systems leadership work was we were starting to think about the leadership attributes of companies And what we found is that the technology is moving so quickly that a lot of these things, we need to embody these competencies inside as individuals. It's not just that the whole company needs to be good, which is hard, but as you pointed out, it's even really hard, if we have to, as individuals, be good at both these things. And so that's, I started teaching the systems leadership course shortly after we did Industrialist Dilemma. And that was supposed to be about the leadership side, but that really, we found that the outside world, so much of what was happening to business leaders and even political leaders today was so much more than just blending digital and physical. There were some other bigger systems at work that we spent a lot of time unpacking.
Yeah, got it. So a few places I want to go. One is this theme that I'm starting to hear that emerges is this idea of becoming self-aware. And I've heard you talk about, and I've read you write about when you work with companies, because you teach, but you also work with companies and you have experience as an operator and entrepreneur. What are some of the key questions that you ask companies that you work with or leaders that you work with that our listeners should start asking themselves?
Well, I'll often ask them to start outside the building. What are the key forces in your ecosystem that are shaping what's happening? What do your customers need and what's shaping in their worlds? And then I start to bring it in. What are the things that we're not doing as a company that we need to be doing and why not? And then I try to bring it into the individual. And with the individual, like the phrase leader know thyself is a mantra that I really think is important. And you talked about self-awareness. We all have strengths and we all have development needs. And the question is, do we know what our own are? And in times of volatility and in times of disruption, we default back to that with which we're comfortable. So my example for me is, in my case, my greatest strength is also my greatest development need. My passion is my greatest strength. If I'm in front of the classroom running up and down the aisles and interacting with the students, that's my happy place. I'm in the flow. I can't wait to get in the classroom. It's awesome. My passion is my greatest development need. And when I was younger in my career, the way it would manifest itself, I got to tell you, I used to send the most amazing flame emails you could possibly imagine. And I would get an email that would anger me, and I'd hit reply all. And I'd maybe put a few more names on, and I'd start typing, and I'd write these emails, and I got to tell you, they were awesome. Everything would flow. I would enter the flow when typing these emails. These emails were caustic, sarcastic, accurate, and always ineffective. And I would spend days cleaning up my mess. And I've had to learn over time to figure out how to restrain that passion. And I'm not as good as I need to be. I'm better than I used to be. And I think this is a thing for leaders to be aware of, is we all have these strengths and development needs. We're human. Knowing what they are for us as individuals and being able to kind of lead through them is a key thing.
And you've said you've quoted a definition of leadership as leadership is the ability to constrain a response to a certain stimulus. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, I first heard that when I was a junior executive at GE decades ago. And in Crotonville, we had this leader, and he taught us this. And I thought, I'm in a room full of 70 of my peers, and he said that, and I thought, okay, he said that just to me because he knows that's my problem. And for me, that email, I see an email that triggers me, and the leadership is the ability not to react. And by the way, I find that I have those reactions when two things are true: when I'm really tired, or if I'm hungry. And God forbid both. And so for the ability to constrain a response is somebody says something that upsets me. It's don't take the bait. Or somebody says something that I disagree with, because by the way, I'm not effective. And that's not my goal. It's if your goal is to get it right, but not be right. Sometimes for me, I need to pull back and say, okay, don't respond now, process, think, and come up with a good strategy to lead. I see that in my teaching. We've now got Gen Z at the grad school level, and they're different than millennials, neither better nor worse, just different. And their lived experience is different. So if somebody from that generation, and I say this as a father of 3 beautiful Gen Z children, if they have been raised and their experience and their lived experience has been a set of interactions, how do I, as the teacher, be effective in trying to guide them, lead them, coach them, as opposed to reacting if I don't, I'm not happy with something that somebody does?
Mm-hmm. This is a tangent, I know, but could you characterize how Gen Z in your experience is different?
I'll give the positive and the negative. The positive side is they're not afraid to speak up and advocate for their needs, which I think is a good thing. Or if they're able to articulate and talk about if they're having challenges, which is a good thing. This notion that I'm going to keep it all bottled up inside is not healthy. On the other hand, sometimes people don't understand the action and the reaction. And my worry is that, and by the way, I blame my generation, right? Because I'm Gen X and we raised them, that sometimes that they're not always aware of how stuff that they will do and say will come out and how it'll land on the other side. So I believe, for example, my job as a teacher is to every day I go in that classroom, do my best. Every day go in and do my best and deliver for them and be prepared and ready. They deserve that. I expect my students to be the same way. And what I want from them is if they're having a bad day or something going on where they can't bring their best selves, tell me ahead of time. Just tell me ahead of time so that I can see their whole self and just be aware of it, as opposed to just taking the notion of, well, I'm just not going to show up today to class. I'm going to hand in a project late and just not talk about it. And I see this, by the way, in the labor force, right? This isn't just a teaching thing. And you talk about people who will manage that generation, and whether it's millennials or Gen Xers or even boomers who don't know how to manage that. There's a set of behaviors that was made to be okay in how that generation was raised. And we've got to figure out, how do we make sure that we guide them and coach them and lead them in a way that can be effective without judging them.
Great point. Great point. I'm starting to hear the connections to your framework of the systems leader, which I want to get into. But first, maybe just set up, what is a systems leader before we go into the 5 that you cover in the book, the kind of 5 aspects. What's your definition? And maybe an example. I know you talk about Target CEO as being an example of a good systems leader.
Well, so systems leaders have the ability to do 2 things. Well, actually, let me even back up. We're in a world of constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change. This is just, and if we look over the last 25 years, we can go from the dot-com meltdown to 9/11 to the global financial crisis, populism 1.0, which was Brexit. It was Bolsonaro in Brazil, yellow vests in France, Trump here in the United States, the pandemic, right? The social unrest that came out of the pandemic. And then we've got now what's happening in government in 2025. And, at some point after, kind of 7, 8 major kind of fundamental things in 20 some odd years, this is the new normal. And the challenge that leaders face is they kind of don't know what to do with all of this constant disruption. And it feels like no matter what they do, they're going to get it wrong. And I argue that the reason that it's hard for them is they haven't been trained in systems thinking. And the idea behind systems leadership is the ability to fundamentally master certain dualities and bring it inside of ourselves. And then also to see systems and understand action and reaction of functions inside of a company and its ecosystem, etc. And in the book, I define both the crisis, I define what doesn't work, and I talk about unserious behaviors in a serious world, which we see quite prominently by a lot of our leaders. And then I talk about, well, okay, how can we handle this and how can we deal with it? The ability to have, a product manager's mindset, understand outside and inside. What do customers need? The ability to live in the duality, the ability to manage context. And then how do they navigate through what I call cross pressures? These cross pressures that people are struggling with. And that's the point of the book.
Explain what you mean by the product manager's mindset.
All right, so this will be conscious bias. My career on the operating side came up through products. And I think product managers are very interesting. Product managers are responsible for everything and own nothing inside of a company. And so, we were talking earlier about organizational jujitsu and that ability to get an organization, like strategic leaders need to do that. You need to get a company to move in a direction when you don't control the resources. And product managers, to me, are the ultimate people who do that. You have to understand what customers want. You really have to know your customers and what do they need and what's their business and how do you solve their problems. Internally, you've got to know how a product is made or how a service is delivered. And so in Silicon Valley, you need to understand engineering, not having to be an engineer, but you need to understand the engineering process. And then there's the third part, which is the go-to-market momentum. How do you sell something? And great product managers understand customers, understand how products are built and delivered, and then understand kind of the commercial aspect of it. And that's that product manager's mindset and the ability to do that organizational jujitsu where you as a product leader can be accepted by different functions inside of a company. It's like, she's a product manager, but she's really an engineer. No. She's a product manager, but really she's a salesperson. She's a product manager, but really in her heart, she belongs on the factory floor with us. And so that's what I mean by the product manager's mindset. And great systems leaders have that ability to kind of blend in with different functions inside of a company, because that's what it takes holistically to serve customers well.
Got it. Okay. So I love it. They have to have the range to go across to understand the entire system, even if they don't have direct influence over the system. They need to understand how they fit together and influence the system to have the outcome. And so I'd love to go into, basically your five, the cross specials that link to these 5 areas of priorities: people, sphere of influence, geography. Could we just go through each one?
Sure. So one of the things that we found as we were studying leaders, we asked them, like, what are they really wrestling with? And we came up with 5, and they're not the only 5.
I love that you said that. Yep. I love that you said that in the book. These are 5, and there are others, but these are the 5 that you chose. Okay.
And these 5, by the way, they interact on each other as well, speaking of systems. So like the first one we talked about was priorities. How do you simultaneously have the ability to both execute as well as innovate? And historically inside of companies, there were leaders like Charles O'Reilly at Stanford here and Michael Tushman at Harvard who came up with the idea of the ambidextrous organization, where you exploit and explore. But those were generally 2 separate parts of the company. You had the people who made the trains run on time, and then the crazy long hairs who innovated. Well, given the speed of innovation right now, leaders need to be able to know how to hit their numbers, but then also make sure that they can manage small teams who are innovating. And similarly, if you're one of the crazy innovators, because innovation is moving so fast, you got to figure out, okay, here's a new technology. How do I quickly get it into commercialization? Because the next set of technology is following right behind it. So that ability to both exploit and explore inside of us as the individual, that's the cross pressure. And so we studied certain leaders who are particularly good at it, like Julie Sweet at Accenture, who make sure that they can deliver on key technologies today that matter for their customers, but also have the ability to keep investing so that the people are learning new skills like artificial intelligence. They've moved from cloud to security to AI, and people need to be fluent in all of these things. The second one we studied was people. How do you project both strength and empathy? And as an example there, we looked at a leader, Kathy Mazzarella. Kathy runs a company most people have never heard of called Graybar. It's the old Western Electric. And, she's got $10 billion in revenue, 12,000 employees. And she was described by somebody as, an iron fist and a velvet glove. Kathy walks into a room and we all sit up a little straighter. This is a strong leader. But she's one of the kindest people I know. She shows her humanity and sees the other person's humanity. The third cross pressure we talked about was sphere of influence, internal and external. How do you understand what's happening outside of the building and inside the building? And we looked at leaders like Charlie Sharp, who's the CFO of Wells Fargo. When he took over, they had committed massive fraud. The regulators were all over them. And he had to be able to simultaneously clean up the mess with the regulators, which Wells Fargo created. And he also had to kind of fix a broken culture internally. And this idea that these things interact with each other is critical. Like the notion of an externally focused CEO and an internally focused COO, that doesn't work anymore. You need to understand that. Fourth is geography, global and local. How do you understand the issues around what's happening inside of a city, but also what's happening in another part of the world, be it for customers or supply chains? And with communication and collaboration tools, even if China and the US, decouple their economies, we're still going to be crossing borders. And we got to know what's going on and how what happens in one part of the world impacts another part of the world. And we're seeing this now in spades with the tariffs. And then purpose is the last one. How do we balance ambition and statesmanship or stateswomanship or stewardship, whatever you'd like to call it? How do we kind of balance that notion of I want to be ambitious and I want to have a career that does well and I want to succeed and be successful? And at the same time, how do I make sure that I'm also thinking about others and not just myself?
Love it. I wish we had more time, but you've got a great book that we'll encourage readers to read and dig into them. I just want to touch on a few of these that have linked to things that have come up on this podcast before. Certainly under priorities, the short term, the long term, the exploit versus explore. That is a challenge that has existed for strategy officers and leaders for a long time. Is anything changed? I think maybe I'd like that the way that you talk about kind of the investor level and investors' role, and we had David Wharton on here, who's also Stanford, and he's very adamant against, hey, if you take VC, and I know that you worked in VC firms and in that world, and you're in that world, they're very short term. So just talk to us a little bit about how do you see dynamics in the investor landscape changing how people manage this dilemma of the short term and long term?
Dave's a great guy. I've known Dave since we were both undergrads at Cal together, and then we were at Stanford at similar times. And his new book where he talks about evergreen companies, and the idea of an evergreen company where it is one that doesn't have have to return capital within a finite period, the way venture capital works. And so that's that ability to have kind of that short-term, long-term mentality. And so I think what happens is, the venture capital model is you want to get really, really big, really, really fast. Not because VCs are selfish, self-centered jerks. They might, in fact, be that, but that's actually not. If the business model is one where you've got to return capital with high returns in a quick period of time. And some companies, play for the long term. And they can, that phrase, it's a great 20-year overnight success. Especially if sometimes you're doing deep technology development, it takes longer. We see this in climate tech. We see this in certain businesses. And so I think you need to be able to invest in the near term and in the long run. And I think what's different, if you're an operator and you're managing an operating budget, you need to have some of your budget in near term and some in long term, and you've got to be able to do both. As an investor, you need to kind of figure out what is your investment strategy. Most VC firms with a 10-year fund are going to be looking for high growth organizations. What Dave's talking about with the evergreen model, if you don't have a fund life cycle that ends in 10 years, you can actually be backing entrepreneurs where their business might take longer and actually might be more sustainable, though it may not have the hyper growth of a venture-backed firm. By the way, it's not that one of these is good or bad. They're just different.
I love that. Yep. I think that's the main point. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I walk away with, that people want to take sides and say, oh, it should be long-term or it should be short-term. It should be for the people or use the people to have the outcomes. It should be local or should be global. But what you're saying is it is that there are cross pressures and we have to understand and balance both of them.
And you need to do both. One of the things I talk about, you mentioned people. I'm a big believer in investing in your labor force, and you have to for a couple of reasons. I joke there's two types of people in the world, those who have hearts and those who don't. And obviously I'm being sarcastic, but in a world where AI is going to fundamentally reshape the labor force so hugely, and jobs are going to go away and new jobs will be created. Okay, if you have a heart, you see the men and women inside of your company who are going to lose jobs. And you say, okay, how do we help them put food on the table and a roof over their head? Let's assume that you don't have a heart and you only care about the bottom line. My teammates in the economics area here have taught me that it's actually 40% less expensive to retrain and reskill my labor force than it is to fire somebody and go hire somebody new. So no matter what's motivating you, you've got to be doing the same things. And the speed of technological change, higher ed, universities, K through 12 can't keep up. So companies need to educate their labor force. They need to be investing in that. And I think that's that duality of kind of thinking about, I believe learning is the new pension, is to use a phrase that Heather McGowan made popular. And so the question is, how can companies be thinking about my labor force? Yeah, people need to own their career, but at the same time, as a company, we can invest in them to allow it to help them succeed and thrive in a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, love it. I mean, each of these are so prescient. We could dig more on that. We've had Stefan Meyer from Columbia. He wrote a book about the people advantage and, that your people are the new customer. I think there is this interesting shift, that we've gone from cycles to competition to customer, and maybe people is the new kind of winning perspective. But yeah, but let's talk about geography a little bit, because I think that's especially right now as we're recording right now, tariffs are the number one topic. You talk about globalization 2.0. How do you see that evolving? Or when you wrote this, it wasn't as dominant as it is now. Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, better to be lucky than good. And then when all of a sudden, the world comes your way, you say, "Oh, look, I
Yeah,
got
right,
lucky."
right, right.
So when I think of globalization 1.0 was basically the displacement of labor and capital, and we moved from a labor arbitrage opportunity. We moved labor like low cost manufacturing to Asia. We moved low cost software engineering to Eastern Europe and low cost customer service to India. Globalization 2.0, I believe, is an interconnected world where you have centers of excellence all over the world and companies work together. And so some of the companies that we studied on this, and they're thoughtful about understanding these interactions, like one of them was a gentleman by the name of Khaldoun al-Mubarak, who runs Mubadala, which is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds based in Abu Dhabi. And Khaldoun's one of the most amazing leaders I've ever studied. One of the things that he talks about is the DNA of Emiratis is trade. If you look at the history of that very small country, they've always interacted with their regional neighbors. And, they're caught between the U.S. and China. The U.S. is their security guarantor. China's their largest customer. And so they don't have conflicts with either. So they're trying to figure out, how do we maintain a friends to all approach and not have exclusive alliances? And they're a very, very small country, but they understand they play a disproportionate role in the world. And he's very aware of that local and global, like, what does the UAE need and how do they serve their citizens and the people who live there, but also understanding the bigger picture. Similarly, another leader we studied is a gentleman by the name of Bill Winters, who's the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank based in London. Bill, understands very much, they do business in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, etc. And how do they kind of balance different needs and points of view with the places that they do business? So they'll put local talent, into regions to make sure they understand that. But part of their business value is they help their customers do business around the world. So they have to understand that interconnected capability is the value they bring to their customer base. If Coca-Cola wants to sell Coke in Angola, that they can help them get there and finance their operations there. So on the other hand, how do you make sure that some of the values of Coca-Cola or the values of Standard Chartered or the values of that country, how do you navigate through them when these things are in conflict? And Bill has a very nuanced approach, and nuance, I think, is a key thing. In a world like this, where it's moving so fast, leaders today need to lead on very nuanced issues in a world that seems to have very little time for nuance.
Great point. Great point. They want to know what your view is and which camp you sit in quickly. Yep.
And sometimes it's hard. Like these are hard issues for a reason. And most of our leaders are not trained in how to navigate and manage these hard issues.
Yes. Yeah, which goes back to your sphere of influence chapter as well, that the lines are blurring between the external and internal. All right, we could do a different podcast on each of these. I'd love to do purpose. We won't, externalities becoming internalities and all the rest. We'll encourage people to read the book. Let me finish with one question. There's a quote from Alan Watts. He basically says, like, in the Wu Wei, in the West, we want growth without decline. We want health without sickness. We want up without down. And Wu Wei tells us, well, there's these two. And it kind of leaves us, from a Western perspective, kind of frozen. Like, well, which way do I go? So what's your advice for someone that is looking to shape the strategy of a company, understanding that there are these cross pressures that we need to balance?
I think at the highest level, it's seeing the systems and seeing action and reaction and understanding that these things are constantly in motion. I think it's the acceptance that these problems are hard and it's going to stay hard. It's not going to be easy. And then for us as individuals, I often like to talk about the parable of the crab and like how to get through this. Now, crabs, like all crustaceans, need to molt their shells in order to grow. And what they do is they fill themselves up with water and they pop off their shells. And they do this because their shells get, chips and parasites. If they don't pop off their shell, they don't grow. And I was reading this paragraph about crabs, like, don't ask me why, but I was. And I read this great sentence. When crabs molt their shells, they go from being vicious predators to soft, paranoid cowards. And when I read that, I went, oh my God, that's just like us as humans. We build up these shells that make us successful and we get promoted and raises. And then all of a sudden we have to pop off our shells and change. And it's scary and it's hard. And what crabs do is they go and hide. And then eventually their shell grows back and they can go back to being predators again. And I think that's kind of like us. Like, we have to learn to let go of that which made us successful, knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable, knowing that it's going to be scary, but the shell will grow back. And, I think that leaders can do a bunch of things that will allow them to just, not only be successful in navigating through these transitions, about finding good mentors inside and outside of the company or trusted partners, learning to actually try new things. There's a whole slew of things that I talk about in the book that people can do. But I think the most important one is kind of that acknowledgement and acceptance that it's scary. It's scary for us and it's scary for our team, but that this can be done. Like, there's nothing that I write about in the book that we as normal people can't do. Ernest Hemingway quoted the New Testament when he wrote his book, The Sun Also Rises. And I like that metaphor, which is, today might be hard and the sun might be going down, but the sun will come up tomorrow and the sun also rises. And if we can hold those two truths of, today's a challenge, but tomorrow's going to be better, I think that's a way to get us and our teams through these times, which, by the way, this is the new normal. And our job as leaders is to take a deep breath and to stand up and lead.
Amazing. Well, Rob, thank you so much. Again, we could go on. This is what the time we have. We're going to certainly encourage people to buy and read the book, The Systems Leader, Mastering the Cross Pressures That Make or Break Today's Companies. How else can our listeners, other people, connect with you, learn from you?
You can go to my website, which is robertsiegel.com, Siegel.com. My Stanford faculty webpage is up and available, and you can ping me with an email. You can link with me on LinkedIn at Robert E. Siegel, and look forward to connecting with the listeners, and doing what I can to help and support them in their journeys.
Awesome. Well, Rob, thanks for the work that you do, for taking some time to unpack it for us, and for writing this great book. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaihan. Great to be here.
Thank you to our guest, Robert Siegel. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kaihan Krippendorff. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you soon with another episode of Outfielders.